It only took 17 seconds. 17 seconds of absolute silence that felt like an eternity as FBI Director Kash Patel sat frozen at the witness table, unable to answer the most explosive question of his career. Congressman Ted Lieu had asked something so specific, so damaging, and so unexpected that it rendered the nation's top law enforcement official completely speechless. And in that deafening silence, everyone in the House Judiciary Committee room realized they were witnessing the moment when everything changed. The question had been building for months, lurking in the shadows of sealed court documents and classified files that most Americans would never see. But Ted Lieu had seen them. And now, in front of live television cameras broadcasting to millions of viewers, he was about to force Patel to confront the most dangerous truth in Washington. What the FBI knew about Donald Trump's connections to Jeffrey Epstein and why they had kept it secret. June 12, 2025, 4:23 p.m., House Judiciary Committee Room 2141 was packed beyond capacity. The air thick with anticipation and the nervous energy that always preceded political earthquakes. For 3 hours, Patel had been navigating questions about FBI operations with his usual blend of deflection and bureaucratic speak. He had survived inquiries about surveillance programs, budget allocations, and personnel decisions. He thought the worst was behind him. He was catastrophically wrong. Lieu sat quietly throughout most of the hearing, occasionally taking notes, but rarely engaging with witnesses. Those familiar with the California congressman's prosecutorial background knew this meant he was preparing for something significant. As a former Air Force prosecutor, Lieu understood the art of building a case methodically, saving the most devastating evidence for the moment when it would have maximum impact. That moment had arrived. "Director Patel," Lieu began, his voice carrying the calm precision of someone who had spent years questioning hostile witnesses. "I want to ask you about the Epstein files that were unsealed by the Southern District of New York last month." The mention of Epstein immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Reporters leaned forward, cameras zoomed in, and committee members who had been scrolling through their phones suddenly paid attention. The Epstein case remained one of the most explosive topics in American politics, with implications that reached the highest levels of government. Patel nodded cautiously. "Congressman, the FIPI cooperates fully with all ongoing investigations, but I cannot comment on specific cases or classified materials." It was a standard deflection, the kind of response that had served Patel well throughout his career. But Lieu wasn't asking about general cooperation or classified procedures. He was asking about something far more specific. "Director Patel, are you familiar with Document 247A from the Epstein file release?" The question was precise and deadly. Document numbers suggested that Lieu had access to specific materials, not just general knowledge about the case. Patel's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. The first sign that he was entering dangerous territory. "Congressman, there were hundreds of documents released. I cannot speak to specific document designations without reviewing the materials." Another evasion. But Lieu had expected it. He reached for a manila folder that had been sitting untouched on his desk throughout the hearing. The same kind of theatrical gesture that experienced prosecutors used to signal that they were about to present devastating evidence. "Let me refresh your memory," Lieu said, opening the folder with deliberate precision. Document 247A is a flight manifest from Jeffrey Epstein's private aircraft dated March 15, 2019. Are you familiar with this document? The date was significant. March 2019 was after Epstein's arrest. After his conviction, after the world knew exactly who he was and what he had done. Any interactions with Epstein after that point couldn't be dismissed as innocent social encounters. Patel's hands moved almost imperceptibly toward his water glass, a tell that experienced interrogators recognize as a sign of increasing stress. "Congressman, I would need to review any specific documents before commenting on their contents." Of course, Lieu replied with the kind of smile that defense attorneys learn to fear. But since you haven't reviewed this document, let me read you what it says. Flight Manifest. Teterboro Airport to Mar-a-Lago. Passengers listed. Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Leo paused, letting the tension build to an almost unbearable level. Every camera in the room was focused on his face as he prepared to read the most explosive name in American politics. Donald J. Trump. The words hit the committee room like a physical blow. Gasps could be heard from the gallery. Committee members exchanged stunned looks. Reporters frantically typed on their phones. And through it all, Kash Patel sat frozen at the witness table, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. Director Ted Lieu continued, his voice steady despite the bombshell he had just dropped. According to this flight manifest, Donald Trump flew on Jeffrey Epstein's private aircraft to his own property in Florida, nearly a year after Epstein's arrest for sex trafficking. Were you aware of this flight? The silence that followed was deafening. 17 seconds of absolute quiet as the FBI director sat motionless, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the committee room walls. It was the silence of a man who had just been confronted with evidence so damaging that he couldn't figure out how to respond without destroying either himself or the man he served. Those 17 seconds felt like hours to everyone watching. C-SPAN viewership spiked as word spread across social media that something unprecedented was happening in the gallery. Reporters held their breath, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment that would define careers and potentially reshape American politics. Finally, Patel found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Congressman, the FBI doesn't typically comment on the travel arrangements of private citizens. It was the weakest response imaginable, a deflection so transparent that it only made the silence more damaging. By not denying knowledge of the flight, Patel had essentially confirmed its existence while refusing to explain what the FBI knew about it. Director Ted Lieu pressed his momentum building. This isn't about commenting on private travel arrangements. This is about whether the FBI investigated a convicted sex trafficker's continued contact with the former president. Did you open an investigation into this flight? Another pause, shorter this time, but equally devastating. Patel was trapped between admitting that the FBI had investigated a former president or revealing that they had ignored evidence of ongoing contact with a convicted criminal. Congressman, any investigative activities would be subject to strict confidentiality requirements. That's not what I asked. Lieu interrupted sharply. I asked a simple yes or no question. Did the FBI investigate this flight? The trap was closing. Any answer would be politically explosive. Yes meant that the FBI was investigating Trump's post-arrest contact with Epstein. No meant that they had ignored evidence of a former president's relationship with a sex trafficker. Patel's legal training kicked in, and he reached for the only escape route available to someone caught between impossible options. Congressman, I invoke executive privilege and can't discuss ongoing or potential investigations. It was a desperate move, and everyone in the room knew it. Executive privilege couldn't be invoked unilaterally by an FBI director and claiming it in response to questions about Epstein suggested that there was indeed something to hide. Director Ted Lieu's voice carried a note of incredulity. You cannot invoke executive privilege on your own authority. That privilege belongs to the president, not to you. Are you telling this committee that President Biden has instructed you to claim executive privilege regarding Donald Trump's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein? The question was a masterpiece of political jiu-jitsu. Lieu had forced Patel into a position where he either had to admit he was claiming privileges he didn't have or suggest that the current president was protecting the former president's relationship with a convicted sex trafficker. Patel's face had gone pale. Sweat was visible on his forehead, despite the air conditioning that kept the committee room at a constant 68. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass again. "Congressman, I misspoke. I cannot comment on investigative matters that might compromise ongoing operations, but the damage was done." Patel had already revealed that there were ongoing operations related to Trump and Epstein. An admission that would dominate headlines for weeks and raised questions about what else the FBI knew but wasn't revealing. Director Patel, Lieu continued, pressing his advantage. "Let me ask you an even simpler question. Are you personally aware of any contact between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein after Epstein's 2019 arrest?" This time the silence lasted only 8 seconds, but it felt just as devastating. Patel was clearly struggling to find an answer that wouldn't end his career or create a constitutional crisis. "Congressman, I cannot discuss information that might be contained in classified files or ongoing investigations." It was another non-denial denial, confirming through his refusal to answer that such content probably existed and was probably documented in FBI files. The implications were staggering. If Trump had maintained contact with Epstein after his arrest, it raised questions about everything from obstruction of justice to witness intimidation. If the FBI had evidence of such contact and hadn't acted on it, it suggested a level of political interference that went to the core of American justice. Director Patel Lieu said, his voice now carrying the full weight of congressional authority. "Your refusal to answer these questions is itself an answer. You're telling this committee that the FBI has information about Trump's relationship with Epstein that you cannot or will not disclose. That's not law enforcement. That's political cover-up." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Lieu had just accused the FBI director of participating in a political cover-up involving a former president and a convicted sex trafficker. It was the kind of allegation that could topple governments. Patel made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Congressman Lieu, I resent the implication that the FBI would engage in any form of political cover-up. We follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of political considerations." "Really?" Liu's voice carried genuine incredulity. "Then why can't you answer a simple question about whether you investigated a documented flight between a former president and a convicted sex trafficker? What evidence are you following, and where is it leading?" The questions came like machine gun fire, each one more damaging than the last. Patel sat silently, clearly unable to provide answers that wouldn't create even bigger problems. The hearing room erupted as Lieu's time expired, and Chairman Jordan attempted to restore order. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories. Committee members huddled in emergency consultations. And somewhere in the chaos, the American public realized that their FBI director had just confirmed that the Bureau possessed explosive information about Trump and Epstein that they were keeping secret. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Within hours, the Trump-Epstein flight was trending worldwide with millions of social media users demanding to know what the FBI was hiding. News outlets scrambled to verify the flight manifest Lieu had referenced while legal experts debated the implications of Patel's non-answers. The political consequences were immediate and severe. Democratic leaders called for the immediate release of all FBI files related to Trump and Epstein. Republican leaders demanded to know why Lieu had access to classified documents and whether the hearing had been orchestrated to damage Trump politically. The president faced mounting pressure to either declassify the files or explain why they remained secret. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of Patel's performance was how his 17 seconds of silence had confirmed every conspiracy theory about government cover-ups and political protection. His inability to answer simple questions about Trump and Epstein suggested that the truth was so explosive that even acknowledging it could bring down the government. Within a week, 3 congressional committees had launched investigations into FBI handling of Epstein-related materials. The Inspector General announced a comprehensive review of the Bureau's investigative procedures. And Patel found himself facing calls for resignation from members of both parties who had lost confidence in his ability to lead an apolitical law enforcement agency. The revelation that the FBI possessed information about Trump's post-arrest contact with Epstein raised questions that went far beyond partisan politics. If a former president had maintained relationships with convicted criminals, the American people had a right to know. If the FBI was hiding evidence for political reasons, it represented a fundamental threat to democratic accountability. And through it all, those 17 seconds of silence echoed through the halls of power as a reminder that sometimes the most damaging evidence isn't what someone says. It's what they refuse to say when the whole world is watching. Years later, Lieu's questioning of Patel would be studied in law schools as an example of how to expose government cover-ups through methodical interrogation. But in the moment, it was simply a congressman asking the right questions at the right time and discovering that the silence itself was the most explosive revelation of all. The lesson was clear. In American democracy, the truth has a way of surfacing. Even when the most powerful people in government try to keep it buried, sometimes it just takes one congressman, one flight manifest, and 17 seconds of silence to change everything.